This episode is brought to you by the Remix Pros, a custom t-shirt and screen printing company that offers its services to the sports culture, skateboard communities, music, cars, fitness, and more. The exclusive t-shirt for this episode is Barbell Dopamine. You can order this t-shirt right from our show notes page. To learn more about the Remix Pros, visit theremixprotees.com. Stay tuned for our episode with Dr. Carl Baird. Odds are, if you played sports growing up, you experienced an injury that somehow shaped who you are today. In fact, the most significant complication arising from previous injuries often isn't the injury itself, but the mental shift that takes place after. Weeks, months later, the healing has taken place, but the thoughts and feelings surrounding the injury still shape our actions. You develop feelings of doubt, that things can never be the same. You have this fear of missing out. It becomes real. You give up on activities that you used to love to do due to fear of re-aggravating the injured area. You convince yourself you have a bad knee, back, shoulder, etc., and nothing can be done. You in essence become your injury. The self-defeating cycle becomes exacerbated in the following ways. Fear. You avoid activities due to fear of re-aggravation, and that keeps the pain injury cycle going. Research has shown that movement and pain get mapped along similar pathways in the brain. This means that following an injury, your brain will remember the movements that caused you pain. In short, avoiding a movement because we fear it will be painful actually increases the amount of pain we experience, regardless of actual tissue irritation. Then there's doubt. Individuals who believe an activity will be painful have been shown to have reduced performance abilities. When we convince ourselves we have a bad knee, shoulder, back, we set ourselves up for failure. The fear and doubt can come from a variety of sources. It can be developed internally through our own emotions. It can be unintentionally worsened by our doctors or stories from family and friends. Regardless, the end result is that our injury slowly begins to define who we are. We become self-conscious about agreeing to that pickup basketball game that we used to play all the time. Now we're worried about getting injured or slowing the game down. At family functions, we fade into the background because we're convinced that we're the uncle or the ex-athlete with the bad back. Today, I have coming on to the show Dr. Carl Baird, a chiropractor, and he's going to tell you to not let your injury define you. Refuse to be a victim of circumstance. Carl's going to tell you that the ACL injury from last year, it sucks. Probably even cause some compensatory movements that you're still dealing with. But at the end of the day, that's not who you are. Strengthening and retraining the body after an injury takes place is entirely possible. Convince yourself that you are capable. Build trust in your body by progressively challenging it in controlled situations. He wants you to take back your control. And one last quote from Dr. Carl Baird is that you are not your injury. You are a person. How you recover and perform moving forward is up to you. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Carl Baird, chiropractor, to the Sports Mastery Podcast. Dr. Baird, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Deshaun.
You know, we discussed before, pain, injury, fear. I know you often get athletes that come into your clinic and they're overcoming probably low back pain. They're overcoming knee pain. How do you deal with that with your clients to get them back into their sport or competition?
Yeah, so that's what you touched on there in that article. It's kind of a two-part process. So there's obviously the healing of the tissues. You got to make sure that the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons, and everything is healed up. But taking that further, you have to regain confidence in those tissues. So especially with major injuries, ACL tears or anything that required surgery or months off, a lot of times people come back and even though the tissues are fully healed, they don't move the way that they used to. And again, a lot of that's because of fear. A lot of that's because of doubt. And a lot of that is because of, they've been in a boot for 3 months or they've not been able to walk for 3 months. And so you get these compensatory movements that, again, just contribute to how they recover. And so it's not just about healing the tissue, but it's identifying those movement patterns and then also taking a step further to help that athlete regain confidence in their body, basically.
Certainly, I know one of the things that we often discuss in my sports mastery program is that having systems and strategies in place to overcome setbacks. We always talk about goals, but at the end of the day, it's like, how do you want to be remembered as a person? How do you want to be remembered as a student athlete? And then you have to have a mindset, and your mindset has to include what's going to happen if A, B, or C happens. And we have to include, we always talk about setbacks. But it could be a setback with a class. It could be a setback at home with mom or dad. It could be a setback on a team. Maybe you lose your position, and then there's always the injury that takes place. So then what systems are we going to have in place, for rehab? And one of the unique positions that I'm in, I also work with athletes, around, have mental toughness strategies, but I also do a lot of the physical training so I can bridge the gap, especially being connected to people like you that are physical therapists, chiropractors, acupuncturists, and licensed massage therapists. So I feel like, in my business and in my practice, knowing and being a part of a community such as yourself, you add great value because I know how and when to prefer based on conversations that we've had in the past and the things that I've learned, from these different disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of you touched on it as being able to address both those issues, the physical training component, but also the mindset component. It's important, again, for performance, which is more what you deal in, but then injury recovery, which is more what I deal in. And I think sometimes clinicians and doctors get so caught up in the physical aspect of healing and recovery, and we often leave out that mental aspect of helping athletes regain confidence in their bodies to be able to perform like they did prior to the injury.
In the past, I know you're a fan of Olympic lifting, teaching progressions and regressions of that. I'm a fan of working with the human body, with athletes as young as possible. Parents often tell me, when can my kids start strength training? And I tell them, we can start when they're 6 years old, as long as they can listen and follow instructions. I know that might feel like it's overwhelming to some, but if a kid will listen and if they can follow instructions, that's all I need. I can teach you how to do an air squat. I can teach you progressions and regressions of hinging your hips or a deadlift or an RDL with a PVC pipe that maybe weighs 2 to 3 pounds tops. So when you're working with an athlete who maybe has suffered a low back injury, maybe they're dealing with sciatic nerves, the low back pain, and trying to get them back into competition, what are some of the strategies that you incorporate with your practice, Dr. Baird?
Yeah, so it's similar, and this is kind of what I found, again, going through chiropractic school and taking a lot of rehab courses and also being involved in the functional movement in the functional movement world as well, is that a lot of the things that clinicians teach their patients to help protect their low back and to help rehab an injury are the same progressions that coaches use to teach cleans, deadlifts, squats, everything, all those Olympic lifts, and being able to break them down after an injury. So you break down the progressions, and you can slowly lead them back up into some higher performing drill like a clean or a deadlift, which is, again, going back to more what you do. But it was interesting to see that, the first thing we teach patients here when they have a low back injury, we teach them how to hip hinge because, again, we want to keep all those compressive loads out of our low back and onto our hips. Our hips are meant to be our weight-bearing joints, and too often, people forget how to hip hinge, and then all that weight's going on their low back, and that sets them up for an injury. So yeah, it's starting with the hip hinge, and then, progressing to functional lifts. So you can go straight to a deadlift, lighter weight deadlifts, or you can teach them how to lift a sandbag, teach them how to lift a box. From there, you progress them to something like a kettlebell swing. So that's more, again, how to generate power from the hips. So the hips aren't only our weight-bearing joints, but they're where we generate most of our power. And something as simple as a kettlebell swing can help people, again, teach them how to generate that power from their hips, which again spares their low back so that it doesn't set them up for injury.
I know you have some links on your website to some videos that discusses the hip hinge, discusses kettlebell swings, and I think you even have the deadlift on there. I'll put those links on in the show, but I want you to try to describe, to the people who really aren't in our world every day, such as parents or the sports coach. It could be the football coach, definitely like a basketball coach in those sports where they kind of shy away from strength training due to, perpetuated myths, so to speak. But maybe they're starting to get into it a little bit. How would without having videos right now, Dr. Baird, how would you describe what is a hip hinge to the parent out there or to the people who don't talk our language every day? How would you describe that?
Yeah, the hip hinge is basically a way to bend forward without rounding the low back. So again, the only movement that's happening if you're bending forward to pick something up off the ground is you're just bending at your hips while you're keeping a neutral spine. And again, that'll take the pressure off of your low back. And that's, again, important to train that movement, especially in athletes, because you want it to be automatic. A lot of times, well, pretty much every time, if you're playing basketball or you're playing football, you don't have time to consciously think, okay, I'm picking up this ball. I have to hip hinge and bend my knees here to pick up this ball to make sure I spare my low back. There's not time to think about that. So it has to be automatic. And so by training the hip hinge through repetition and repetition, over and over through things like strength training and lifts, when you're actually out on the court or out on the field, your body's just automatically going to go to that position. And that's really why it's so important. You just want it to be automatic so you don't have to think about it anymore.
I'll see a lot of basketball athletes, high school basketball athletes, middle school basketball athletes. They'll do jump training. They'll do some body weight calisthenics. You see these kids, they're doing fancy things that they see, people putting on YouTube, and it might be something that an NBA athlete has put online or his coach. But when we're looking at the young athlete that's in high school playing basketball, definitely playing AAU basketball, from our perspective, we know what's going to happen at some point. They're going to have an ankle injury. They're going to have a low back injury. Something is going to happen. If we're talking to the coach and parent out there, what are some things for them to do in terms of prehab before an injury happens that could help them recover after an injury much faster?
Yeah, so that, again, it goes back to the movement pattern. So again, most of the injuries we see, unless it's a direct trauma, like, getting tackled at the knee or something like that, most of the injuries we see are more cumulative in nature, which means they're kind of smaller irritations that add up over time until a big injury happens. And a lot of times those smaller irritations are caused by improper movement patterns. So those things just get compounded over time. If you're playing basketball and you're running however many miles a day, but you don't have the hip strength to control how your knee is moving and landing on the ground, and you do that for months to year round, you're eventually going to suffer an injury. So in terms of the prehab, what we really want to focus on is mastering that movement pattern and making sure that that's ingrained, and then building strength. Once we have that movement pattern down, building strength around that movement pattern, just to hold everything in place and make sure we don't get injured.
I can really appreciate that when you talk about the hip hinge, because, when I'm teaching athletes how to jump, And especially if they're new athletes, even on a snap down just to jump up to the box, you'll see valgus knees. Then if we step on, like, let's say a 12-inch box, and I want to see where they are from a drop jump perspective, you see valgus knees. And I really feel like everything that you're discussing in terms of the hip hinge is a precursor to maybe minimize potential back injuries and develop those movement patterns and show them how to, one, jump properly, but also land properly. So it goes both ways. If I see the valgus knees, I can pretty much tell 9 times out of 10, that's what's going to happen on game day when they're coming down for a rebound or when they're going up for a layup. Because a lot of these injuries, like you kind of alluded to before, are non-contact injuries based on faulty movement patterns over several years.
Yeah, and I think what else is important too is that these aren't necessarily sports-specific movements that we're talking about. Like these movements, the hip hinge, lifting things off the ground, cleaning, these are something that transcend all sports. So whether you're a basketball player, a football player, a baseball player, they're still all important to learn because, again, they translate to all those sports versus something a lot of times trainers get so sports-specific that, again, they make you a better basketball player, but what we really want is to make somebody a better athlete. And then by being a better athlete, you're going to be a better basketball player, you're going to be a better football player, you're just going to be better at work, you're going to be better just in life.
What are some of the things, or what would you say your best practices or conversation would you explain to the parent or athlete, after injury, what should they be doing to rehab? Let's take, for instance, a low back injury or what's most common in basketball, that ACL injury to the young athlete. What mindset should they have to expedite recovery?
Yeah. So if we're talking about mindset, I think the most important thing they need to understand is that the pain is temporary. So a lot of people get it fixed in their head that, this is just going to be forever. They again develop fear that, this is going to be career ending. And they develop that doubt that things aren't going to be the same. And so making sure from a mindset that you address that, hey, this pain is temporary. Like you can come back from this injury, and yes, it's going to take work. Yes, it's going to take dedication to stick to a plan, but it's entirely within your control to come back. And I can create the plan, but you got to stick to it. And if you stick to it, we'll get you back to where you were prior to the injury.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you really have to pay attention to and listen to what Dr. Carl Baird is telling us today. If you're an athlete, if you aspire to get to some of the highest level, that's Division I athlete, that's Division I athletics, going pro or aspiring to go to the Olympics, there's always tweaks that upper end athletes, that higher end athletes that are always going through. So at some point, you're going to have an ankle injury. At some point, you're going to have a knee injury. You're going to have a low back injury, depending on the sport. So right now, you can start doing research on rehabbing the ankle, rehabbing the knees, how to overcome an ACL injury or ACL surgery, so you're prepared and you know what to do if and when that time happens.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important about these movement patterns too is so they've found that the number one predictor of a future injury, of somebody suffering a future injury, is a previous injury. And so a lot of times, and this was me, and this is actually why I got into the chiropractic field, was I played basketball growing up, did the AAU, got some offers to get in smaller schools. I wasn't that good, but I would roll my ankle. I'd roll my ankle probably 2 times a week. And we didn't have any trainers. I didn't have any doctors that I went to. I'd stick my ankle in an ice bucket. I'd wait for the swelling to go down, and then get back on the court and play because, I was taught if you miss practice, you're not going to play in a game. So I would just go out there and play on top of it. And then when I was 19, I actually suffered a Achilles tendon tear in my left foot. And again, an Achilles tear, that's an injury that usually happens to 40 to 50-year-olds as your body starts to age a little bit. It's usually not something you see in a 19-year-old. And it was in the same ankle that I consistently rolled probably 2 times a week playing basketball in high school and just never did anything to address it. So again, then that just leads to more injuries. So again, my left foot's still not as strong as my right, and that causes changes in movements, which can lead to hip pain and everything like that. And so really making sure that you have a plan, again, to prevent that injury in the first place, because again, the biggest predictor of suffering another injury is that previous injury. And so that's part of the reason why the prehab is so important.
And I hate to say it, and it's not to knock or bash all high school programs, but you have to remember some of those athletic trainers that they have on are interns or they're new to the industry. And what Dr. Carl Baird is telling you is he didn't have any resources. He didn't have any real help at the time. So that's why it's important. You have to do research and probably get outside of your community when you're trying to heal faster with a specialist like Dr. Carl Baird. Now, Dr. Baird, I want to go to the left now. What are some of the common causes in low back pain in the young athlete?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different causes, but I think a big problem is sitting. You know, a lot of these high school athletes spend 6 to 8 hours sitting in a classroom. And again, most likely, most of them not in good posture, kind of that rounded back. And then, the bell rings and it's time for practice. And they're just not moving. They haven't moved for 6 to 8 hours, and now they're expected to move to do high performance movements. And again, it leads to that minor low back pain. Let's see, what are some other ones? Again, not training. So again, a lot of times what you see is the deconditioned athlete, especially for fall sports, which are coming up now, is they've been off all summer. Haven't done much of a training program, and then all of a sudden August hits and it's daily doubles and they're deconditioned. And being deconditioned and then expecting your body to perform at its best usually doesn't work, and usually sets us up for some pain, whether it's back pain or knee pain. And the problem with that, and again, I actually worked in a high school with high school athletes for a year before opening my clinic, and once the high school season started and pain develops, you got really two options. It's rest it and rehab it, or play through it. And those are really the two options, because if you're resting and rehabbing, you're probably not going to be playing in games. And then if you're playing through it, again, you're just kind of furthering that cycle of pain and injury. And so that's why, again, going back to why the prehab is so important. If you can avoid that pain in the first place through training, through being conditioned, so that when the season starts, you're ready to go, it's just going to benefit you throughout the whole season.
I've often expressed the same thing, because student athletes, they're sitting 6 to 8 hours a day. So the hips are flexed. So that means you're sitting on your butt. Those hip flexors are shortening. And I often encourage my athletes always to do some hip mobility and hip stability work, and where you're working through hip extension drills and movements, because you've been sitting all day. And the funny part is, coaches expect their players to run fast, and they wonder why they drop in times at a certain point, because you're sitting in flexion all of the time, or you're being in flexion in certain sports. But really, to jump higher, to run faster, you have to be able to get to hip extension, depending on the sport or activity at the right time.
Absolutely. That's how you generate power from the hips, with that hip extension. And so something as easy as jumping, that's all hip extension and being able to generate that power. And yeah, you're right. If you're sitting all day, that's going to become a lot harder when you're expected to do that after sitting for 6 hours.
From your practice, Dr. Baird, I know you see a lot of athletes, some young athletes too. And in your research, in your schooling, what would you say to our audience in terms of what are some of the common causes of knee pain in the young athlete?
Yeah, and I think knee pain is actually pretty interesting. Knee pain, I would say probably 90 to 90% of the time, knee pain is caused by deficiencies elsewhere in the body. And I think the most common area that you see it in is hip strength. So again, if you lack that hip strength, what you see is, again, you mentioned it earlier, but that valgus knee, that knee coming in. And what that does is, anytime you see that valgus knee, you're putting increased stress on what I call the passive stabilizers of the knee, which is your MCL, your ACL, your PCL, your LCL. And again, that all stems from the hips. Another one that's really important, and we test with every athlete here in the clinic, it's called ankle dorsiflexion. So how far you can bring your knee over your toe. So if you're limited motion in the ankle, that gets translated up and can cause a lot of pain at the knee. And I think the third, probably most common one you see, are deficiencies in core strength, and not only core strength, but core coordination as well. And if those three things, the hip, ankle, and core, aren't functioning the way that they should, I'd say those are probably the primary causes of knee pain, which is funny because even though the issue is somewhere else at the body, it presents down at the knee.
There's always some misnomers when it comes to the benefits of Olympic lifting in terms of working on those progressions and regressions. In your practice and in your experience, explain to our audience, Dr. Baird, some of the benefits or the benefits of Olympic lifting, whether you're doing progressions or regressions, working with a PVC pipe, a 15-pound training bar, on up to a regular 45-pound bar.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think the primary, at least again, this is my mind as a clinician, goes back to training those movement patterns. So being able to train the hip hinge, being able to train the lift, being able to train generating power from the hips in a full body dynamic movement, like a clean, like a squat, like a deadlift, is going to be the most important for, again, avoiding injury. So it's, again, you can just ingrain those movement patterns so that when you're playing basketball, when you're playing football, when you're playing soccer, they just happen automatically. The second thing that I think is important is just developing that strength. So I think a lot of injuries happen. It's not necessarily because we lack flexibility, especially in kids. A lot of kids are actually still pretty flexible, but they do lack the proper strength to handle a lot of the loads that are required in football and, in any sport really. And so that would probably be the second most important, is, again, developing that strength and ingraining those movement patterns so they happen automatically.
Right. Dr. Baird, I really appreciate you coming on today. Was there anything else you would like to discuss in terms of overcoming injury, fear being included, and doubt?
Yeah, I think we covered most of the most important things. And I think if somebody could take away one thing from this, is that, your body's going to heal. But addressing that mental aspect, it takes an active participation in the rehab process. And so when you do get injured, don't just sit back and let the body heal. Like, actively take control and get on a plan to whether it's healing the tissues or creating that right mindset. So that, again, you can come back better than you were before the injury.
I agree 100%. You've heard me say this before, but student athletes, parents, coaches, you have to have a legacy. How do you want to be remembered as a student athlete? How do you want to be remembered as a coach? How do you want to be remembered as a parent? How do you want to be remembered as an individual? Now, I'm specifically talking to the athlete right now. How do you want to be remembered as a student in your community? Once you establish that and answer those questions, you have to move on to your vision. Based on your goals, where do you see yourself? What does it look like? What does it smell like? Now, from there, I want you to consider your mindset, because there's going to be obstacles. Things are going to get in your way. Freak accidents are going to happen. An unforeseen injury will happen. What systems and strategies can you put in place now to mitigate those factors or overcome them faster? Now, outside of that, I want you to think about inventory. These are people, places, and things. What inventory do you have to help you achieve your vision, get to your goal, and establish your legacy? Do you have people like Dr. Baird in place? Do you have your personal coaches? Are you connected to your parents? Again, at Sports Mastery, this is designed to bridge the gap between the student athlete and the parent, and the student athlete and the coach, and synergize these relationships. People like Carl and I are more like a corner man, where we can understand it from both sides because we've been through this experience before. We know what our strengths were, but more importantly, we've learned a lot from our weaknesses of what we were doing at the time, or the things that we didn't have in place. So I really appreciate Dr. Baird coming on. This has taken us a month to pin down this interview. Go to Sports Mastery on iTunes, rate and review this show, give this a 5-star. This really helps with our iTunes ratings and getting to the top of the list. I would very much appreciate if you do that. before we close out, Dr. Baird, tell my audience where they can find you at.
Yeah, so the easiest place would be our website. That's just www.performancehealthcarepdx.com. If you are located in Portland, Oregon, we're located in inner northeast Portland off 7th and Hancock. And then also we got social media where we post videos and we post exercises pretty much every day. And that's going to be Performance Healthcare PDX on Instagram and Performance Healthcare PDX on Facebook as well.
So if someone from Portland, Oregon, or they happen to be traveling in Portland right now, they hear this, they want to come in and see you, what would you say to that individual?
Give us a call. We're here.
Okay, what number should they call you at, Dr. Baird?
Oh, yeah, that might be helpful. It's 503-954-2495.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you heard it here first with Dr. Carl Baird on the Sports Mastery Podcast. Enjoy your day. Listen to this a couple of times. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Deshaun at sportsmastery.com. You have Dr. Baird's information. Reach out to him. There might be a gift if you just happen to walk into the clinic over there and tell him that you heard about him on the Sports Mastery Podcast. I'll leave that alone. Peace and blessings.